Danish Landscape Architects is a professional organization. So we are not the union. We're not dealing with salaries and stuff like that. But we're dealing with every landscape architect's wishes and issues for the profession.
Hi and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast. This time we will continue with the landscape architecture series. These are the series that I started at Urbcast some time ago and have been getting quite good feedback so far. So I am happy to hear that you are interested into landscape architecture. I know that some of the episodes so far have similar topics, but this is exactly something that I wanted to capture. So how different offices, different directors or head of landscape departments in various architecture offices or landscape architecture offices, how do they approach landscape architecture in terms of design, but also managing and organizing their work at the studios. But also today, the topic and the approach will be a bit different. We will focus on the Danish Landscape Architects Association, and we will talk about the role of this whole association. And my guest today will be Martin Hedevang Andersen, who is the chairman at the Danish Landscape Architects. So at the Danish Landscape Architects Association, he's also the team lead of the Landscape and Urbanism department at the architecture office called CF Møller Architects. And today we will cover different topics. We'll discuss about the role of the association, as I said, and also about the state of the industry overall in Denmark, as well as about some challenges, like, for example, greenwashing. Welcome to the newest episode. So, welcome to the newest episode. We are talking landscape architecture because it's the landscape architecture series. While we are discussing the topic of landscape architecture, especially in the Danish context, it's hard not to talk to you, Martin. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because you are chairman of the Danish Landscape Architects, and I think your experience and your interesting perspective and lens on landscape as a profession is something that I really would like to get onto the show, because I've been talking to some landscape architects from different offices, landscape or architecture offices here, mostly in Copenhagen. But you have those two hats, those two perspectives, as a head of landscape at CF Møller, and also as the chairman of the Danish Landscape Architects.
Well, not yet the head of landscape, but the team leader.
A team leader.
Yeah, team leader here in Copenhagen. Yeah.
Okay.
So we also have a head of landscape, but he's in Aarhus.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Just so nobody gets mad at me.
Yes. No, of course. I think I would especially like to focus on the Danish Landscape Architects, so the Danish Landscape Architecture organization and association. Maybe you will just explain in a bit how should we call it exactly. But as an opener, I often like to ask my guests what are their kind of first meeting with the landscape architecture and what inspired them to become landscape architects. So yeah, it would be so interesting to hear your story. How did you get interested in the field?
That's a good question, and I think it's often a good question. It's also a good question to ask landscape architects whether that was their first choice of education, especially the ones educated from the University of Copenhagen, because often it's a profession where you go a little around, then you find it. It's not the first choice of many. And I think it's due to education that it's not something that's very much taught in high school or public school for that sake. I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I'm proud of this, but my education background is I started actually in geography, bachelor's in geography and in urban planning especially, and I found that I could do a lot in that academic field, but I also wanted to do more than writing and more than analysis. So I really wanted to create something. So I think in that perspective, and then overlaps of those two professions, planning geographical way or in a landscape architecture way, I did similar courses. And then I went out traveling and with no plan, but tried to find out what I would like to, or how I would like to continue my studies when I went back. So sat in Peru, I think it was, and decided that maybe I should do a change. Came back and started up the landscape architecture studies, and 5 years later, I was done. So that was my introduction.
I think it's still not that far from geography and planning, because Jens Linnet, the founder of Bogle Landscape Architects, he wanted to be an actor.
Yeah.
So that's quite far. And then you end up being this influential landscape architect in Copenhagen. All right. But what was your kind of first way into landscape architecture then? Because studying is one thing. And definitely I would like to discuss studying today as well, because I hear about this disconnect between studying and then once you enter into the field. Of course, there's limited number of opportunities for getting into the field. Internships, for example, there are only some of them, and not everyone can get them. So how did it work for you? What was your professional journey as well since you graduated?
Well, I was about to write my master thesis and discovered that I only had been once at a studio, and I actually wanted to work at a studio. When I worked at a studio, architectural studio, that was in my geography studies. So I decided to postpone my master thesis to do an internship, and I was lucky to be hired by Polyform, a former company, or not existing company anymore, but Værk is kind of taken on from that. And that was a very nice experience. There was a very nice team out there at the moment. There was a small landscape department, but everybody was kind of working together, and I learned a lot. And that was basically my way into the field as a student.
I think we also finished with some recommendation to like students and young landscape architects. As said, I would like to develop the Danish Landscape Architects approach to all of that, because you are the chairman for over 3 years now, I think. Could you explain what is this association doing actually for, like, to someone who is maybe just new to landscape architecture, not very embedded into the field, or maybe someone who wants to come to Denmark to pursue this profession? What exactly is Landscape Arkitekter?
Danske Landskabsarkitekter is a professional organization. So we are not the union. We're not dealing with salaries and stuff like that. But we're dealing with every landscape architect's wishes and issues for the profession. And that can be if you're hired in a studio, if you're hired in the municipality, if you're hired in the state, if you're hired elsewhere. We are discussing the core of the business, or not the business, because we're also not the business organization. There's also another organization for that. But kind of the core of the profession. And the core of the art, you might say. So we're discussing how to preserve historical important landscape architecture. We're discussing how to evolve, how to push the limits for sustainability, how to push the limits for biodiversity. We are doing courses in different computer software. We're doing courses in biodiversity. And we're also trying to be the landscape architectural voice into the debate, especially here in Denmark, but probably also all over the world. Landscape architecture is really something that is, it's not just a little small design field, but it's just something that really touches a lot of people. And now we have an understanding broadly in the society of the importance of good landscape architecture. In a dense city like Copenhagen, where we sit right now, people really start to understand the value living in smaller apartments, understand that they can't have all the square meters they need, and then understanding that public spaces, courtyards, parks, urban spaces, whatever, can be kind of an extension of their living room. I think we really saw it under the pandemic, for example. So our role is basically to promote the role of the landscape architect, to make sure that there is a landscape architect involved when we are doing public spaces, parks, and all that. It's not a big issue in Denmark. It can be out in the world. But still, we need to promote this role, this profession, and that's what we're doing and trying to achieve on a daily basis.
So it's an easy job, because landscape architects, I think they are part of the dialogue, of the debate, but also of the design of spaces in Denmark often. I think this relation is, as you said, way better than in different countries where maybe landscape architects are not as used, or they are not part of the design process early on. Often happens here in Denmark. Would you say that you are enough of a voice if it comes to landscape architecture? Because you have around 800 members in this association. Do you know how big percentage of all landscape architects it is in Denmark?
We don't. We're actually quite curious. So if anyone knows that number, I would like to know. And we talk, not a lot, but we talk about it from time to time, that we actually don't know how many landscape architects we are. But we are a solid amount, or a solid percentage. that gives us the opportunity to speak in a lot of places and a lot of positions. And yeah, we might be a small association, but often we are placed along with bigger associations and speak at the same level as they do, because we are in this very important field that is very important due to climate change, climate adaptation, biodiversity crisis, inequality crisis, and so on. So we get the opportunity. We can maybe say that we are performing a little bit above what we should in numbers, but we are also the advocates or the ambassadors for a quite important field, I would say. To me, it's not super important how many we are, as it's more important that we actually have a chance, and we are taking that chance to speak this profession.
Could you say what could be an example of a situation where you could support landscape architects? So can you, once you are a member of the association of DL, can you really feel it?
I really hope our members can. I think the most important thing I can do as a chairman is to step up at every occasion I get a chance to speak or get a chance to write. So when different magazines calls me, when you calls me, I really do my best to be able to go out and talk about the things that we find important as landscape architects. That's the best I can do. It's also, it's fun, of course, and it's always great to talk about landscape architecture, I think. But it's also important to have the debate in the broad society, to talk about our field. And also because the more we talk about it, the more relevant we kind of become. So I also like to I think every landscape architect should talk about his profession, his passion and stuff like that. And the more we are that speak this language, so to say, the broader in society our message can go out.
A member of Dansk Landscape Architects gets this MDL title in front of their name. What does it stand for, and does it have any power?
That's a good question. And the easy part is that it says members of Danish Landscape Architects. To be a landscape architect as well as an architect is not a title that is specifically linked to an education or something like that.
It's like not protected.
No, it's not protected. The only way to kind of have a protected title as a landscape architect is to be a member of our association. And to do that, you need to have been attending one of the free schools here in Copenhagen, the University of Copenhagen, the architecture school here in Copenhagen, and the architecture school in Aarhus. Or you will have to have worked for 2 years in a landscape architectural company, show your CV, show your projects, and then you can also be a part of our association.
Even if studied abroad?
And if you studied abroad, we have sister organizations. We also have a worldwide organization. And there is a whole system and a whole list of different universities and so on where we can take people automatically. Or if you've studied abroad, if you worked for a couple of years, you can again apply just by sending your CV and a couple of project references. So we're trying to be as open as possible, but we also need to protect the title, so to say. Yeah. So there needs to be some professional knowledge.
I'm trying to understand what's the character of this organization, because I'm just not sure if it's common in different countries. That's why I'm also exploring the topic of landscape architecture, because you said in the beginning that you are not a union, so you can't vouch for landscape architects in that way. So I'm trying to find what's the core and what's this kind of physical aspect of, or something that you can see as a member.
Yeah. It's also important to understand Danish landscape architects as a community, a professional community. So it's a place where you meet your friends and colleagues, you meet your ex-colleagues, you meet the ones you have been studying with, you meet the ones that you have just been meeting throughout this network. And that might be the most physical element, that you actually are meeting and interacting, often with landscape architects as kind of the common ground. And another aspect is that we have a magazine we send out 8 times a year. So we also have a quite, I have to say, but I also really, really believe a quite beautiful magazine that really talks and goes deep into different subjects of landscape architecture. I think this kind of association is unique. I mean, there is one for architects, Arkitektforeningen, of course, and we also have a close relationship with them and do things together and look quite alike. But I'm not sure that there is that many of these types of association in other professions here in Denmark, at least. Often the things that we do is often done by the unions as a supplement to the core of a union. So I think it's unique. But is, as I said before, also something that is happening worldwide. So we in, 70 years ago or something like that, was a part of starting Denmark was a part of starting an European association, and then and now there is regional landscape architecture associations in all over the world, and there's also a worldwide organization on top of this, and both are doing conferences. All of them are doing conferences. All of them doing policy making, especially the one we have in Europe are working a lot with the EU, trying to push and promote the role of the landscape architects in that sense.
And what's your relation to other offices here in Denmark? If we talk especially about the landscape architecture offices, are you promoting them? Are you in a dialogue with them? Are you maybe defending them if there is like some sort of a public debate about the project and you need to kind of stand up and say, okay, that's how the things are done? Or
I mean, I think it's important again to understand that we are not an association for companies. We are not an association for municipalities and so on. We are an association for the landscape architect. So if there is a business owner who's also a member, I will treat him as that, as a landscape architect. So of course we are promoting landscape architecture. Of course, and by that we're also promoting the businesses. But there is again an association that are advocate and do policy making for the businesses. So we're more an association again for the design art. And by that, we are promoting Danish landscape architecture. We're promoting it, of course, inwards to ourselves, so everybody knows what happens. We're doing that especially through our social media, through our magazine, and so on. So when something new is up, we are trying to take a deep look into that. Sometimes we ask the different studios to do tours. So there is guided tours of different newer projects around the city. So again, you can come out, you can get the in-depth descriptions, you can get the stories, what was easy, what wasn't easy, and all that. The things that you not necessarily can see from the web pages or in the classical media. And by that, I wouldn't say we're promoting the businesses, but we're promoting the work that they're doing in the landscape architecture. Especially if there's a good story, something we need to learn. I mean, knowledge sharing again in a time with all sorts of different crises, new ways of thinking landscape architecture. The 10 or more 12 years I've been, or 15 years I've been in landscape architecture, it's been a huge change. I mean, the perspective, the way that we design, the ideas and all that. And I think it's, again, very, very important that we as an association is promoting this and showing what is going on so the profession can again evolve into the future while we are seeing it running around us, so to say. And
what if story is not successful? Let's say there is a project that you wouldn't like to promote because it lacks some qualities. Would you be critical? Like, are you critical enough?
Probably not. But it's a balance. It's always a balance. And I, as a person, also, of course, have an opinion on different projects. But I also think that it's important that we support each other. I can mention a couple of projects where we can be critical and where I think we should be critical, but I would never be critical about the landscape architecture, because I know also from being a trained professional, I know that there's always a lot of effort put into these projects. And I know that I really don't believe, at least I won't believe, I don't like to believe that there is landscape architects who just does it for the money or stuff like that. I mean, so also in these projects that often becomes quite big in media, Lynetteholm, Felleby, all these things. There's still some very, very passionate landscape architects that works in these projects and really try to do the best within the framework that has been set up. So if I should be critical, I would be critical about the decision making. I would be critical about the way the different permits have been given, if there's been done enough surveys into environmental aspects and stuff like that. And that I can be critical of course. But the role of the landscape architects, I strongly believe that when a project is put out, that nobody just does it to do harm. I don't believe that any landscape architect does that. And I also believe that when these decisions has been made, it's very important that we are in these projects, that we don't stand outside and say, all right, we don't want these projects. We don't want to be a part. We don't want to be involved in these things, because if we just stand on the outside, then somebody else would try to do our job. We know that from when architects go out of architecture projects and somebody else is trying to do that, we know the issues. It's very, very visible what the problems then become. So I think even though we might not agree with the decision of making those projects where they are and all that, I think it's important that we're still trying to go into them when we can stop them, so to say, and try to do the best that we can do then. I think that we should come from a starting point where we are critical, but I still think that it would be a shame that we just say, okay, we don't want this because we don't think this should ever be built here. Well, the reality is that often there will be built when we are at that point. And the decision is made, and the building is sometimes also, and that's of course also an issue, but the building is maybe already rising when we are inviting into this project.
Yeah, the reason I ask about this critical aspect of the profession is that I also wanted to talk about some threats that you could see for the landscape architecture as a profession, as a field, because of course there are different projects. Some of them might be controversial. I will just mention Copenhagen, which is the big building, and it's like a waste plant with a huge slope on the top of it that you can ski and snowboard on like all year round. And I actually addressed that with a conversation with Julia, who's the head of landscape at BIC, that some people find this project controversial and as an example of greenwashing, that you put a lot of these elements on the top of it, and you also have those sliding. The cladding for the sliding, it's also like a lot of plastic, and it has to be removed and redone every couple of years. So basically, there are different projects in Denmark, I guess, that some people are critical about. Whether it is greenwashing or not, do you think that there is still a threat for the profession, that the greenwashing will be a part of the profession? And also not only greenwashing, but in general. Let's discuss the threats.
Yeah. I mean, you can also talk about public space washing, or, putting too high hopes into a public space and promoting that too many people would actually go there and they would not. I mean, I think greenwashing is probably the key here. There's of course several threats, but greenwashing is of course something that we should be aware of. Taking your example of Copenhagen, well, you can talk about a landscape on top of a building, but basically it's a rooftop project, so to say, and it might sloping, but still it is a very man-made construction, and we should of course have those. And I think it's better when we are building large buildings that we add at least the possibility for people to be on top of them, to go up, to see the views. Also, when we are building high-rise buildings, which this building also, it is often nice if there is a public possibility at least to get to the top of this building. I really like to promote this.
Is that enough though? Because sometimes you have those towers and you have this, two small trees you put on the terrace and you say it's amazing green public rooftop, which is not.
But again, that's my argument here. We're not helping or saving anything by adding these in terms of nature and in terms of the core of landscape. So it's a good thing for public, it's a good thing for people, but we're still in this very man-made arena. Shouldn't we do it? I don't think so. I think we should do it. And I think it's a huge part of promoting landscape architecture that we can do these kind of things, that we can actually achieve these a little odd but still interesting landscapes, and we can place them in everywhere. In that sense, I think it also makes it easier, because by having those examples, you can really show the broadness of our profession. But if you only do things on top of a building and not do anything on ground, then it becomes a problem. I mean, it needs to be a landscape project that does more than just put a green hat on a building. And of course, in that sense, we are fighting the space, especially in our urban areas. How much space can we use for this? How much space can we use for that? We also would like road. We also would like bike lanes. We also would have wide sidewalks and all these things. So there is a discussion about space in our cities that we need to be aware of. In that sense, I would say that I actually don't think we're good enough of putting in landscape elements, putting in trees and stuff like that. We are very, very far from the recommendations of green foliage coverage. So how many square meters of our city is underneath trees or leaves, so to say. We should be around 30%. We're not there. We see other cities similar to Copenhagen that has projects going this direction. We don't dare to.
I would overall agree. I would overall argue, that's my argument I sometimes use, that Copenhagen is not such a green city.
I mean, we're good at talking about it being a green city, and we're good at talking about being a green city. I think a lot of it comes from that we bike a lot, and thereby see the city as something that is more humane. But we need to put on top this layer. And I mean, yeah, you can talk about greenwashing there, but I would again also argue that there is actually a lot of things done to promote landscape architecture in our cities. So, and now we're talking a lot about Copenhagen, but it's the same thing in other cities, small, big, throughout the country. I really believe that the municipalities out there are spending a lot of money, and I can really see that also in public projects, in housing projects, and so on, these green areas become a huge part of the narrative. It is becoming something that people buy into and look into when they want to rent or buy a new apartment. Where are the green areas? How does the courtyard look? What is the atmosphere when I walk into this? It really pivoted from just looking at how many bathrooms do I get and what's the view, to now also these green spaces around. And then another aspect of this, I mean, of course, trees and plants and all that's something we would like to see, and it gives us a recreational purpose, and we become very happy by looking at it and all that. It's healthy and these things. And I think in terms of greenwashing, we're pretty all right there. Where I can see the problem is with biodiversity. And there is a lot of confusion about this theory or this word. What does it mean and what not? And I mean, we used, 30 years to define sustainability. So I really also believe that it will take some time to define biodiversity. Well, maybe not from biologists and maybe also not from landscape architects. I think the knowledge is about to be in a good state, but broad in society. Because biodiversity is not just adding a tree. It's not just adding, a lot of flowers in a very uncoordinated way. I mean, there is more to that. And there is also this understanding now, at least within the field of landscape architecture, that biodiversity is not necessarily solved in our cities. Should we then stop planting in our cities? Should we then stop doing biodiversity projects in our cities? I don't think we should. And this is where it becomes a little bit on the edge of greenwashing, because we are saying that we're doing biodiversity in our cities. We're saying that we are helping stuff. We are not necessarily helping at a scale that we want. We actually want to go out in the cities and really take up huge part of lands if we really would like to do something for biodiversity. But if we don't add it into our cities, then people won't see it, and then they won't understand it. But having it close, understanding wild nature, understanding that a grass lawn shouldn't be trimmed every second week, but it should grow a little wild. Understanding that nature has a will of its own, that is important to show it in the city where people are, and to show that it's not dangerous, if we want it to be added out of our cities, in the open fields and so on. So maybe we are promoting biodiversity projects in our cities. Maybe it isn't actually biodiversity. Maybe it could be called greenwashing. Maybe we should change about it. But I still think it's very, very important to continue doing this in order to learn and to teach about nature for the broader Danish society. Yeah, so I think labeling is maybe the right thing, and then of course telling the right story, and not just putting in some good marketing words.
So yeah, I think there is a thin line between biodiversity and greenwashing. And you touched upon those critical issues, I think, in the profession of landscape architecture, but more broadly as well, architecture, urban design, where you say that something is sustainable, that's like a sustainable project or sustainable development, or this project has biodiversity. I mean, what does it mean that a project has biodiversity? I think that's something that requires more and more discussion and defining. But we have limited time on this podcast, so I wanted to move to another topic. You said that the profession developed a lot since you joined those 10 or 12 years ago. But is it in a good place now? So what's the state of landscape architecture as profession, as industry here in Denmark?
When I started my studies in 2010, I think it was, we just been starting up this whole discussion about climate adaptation. We saw the huge rainfalls here in Copenhagen in 2011 and so on. So that really took a lot of attention at the university. And lots of people, myself, of course, and also the other, really start to look into to how to deal with all this rainwater. And I think that was a very, very important place in the role of Danish landscape architects in general in society, because we really saw how much we are threatened by climate change and how much we're not prepared for it. I mean, our sewer system is dimensioned completely differently. These rainfalls should only happen once every 100 years and so on. And then they happen 2 or 3 times within 10 years. So that we have some issues in society where people really needed, or where we needed to do things differently. And then landscape architects came with a great solution. Instead of digging up everything and doing these very technical solutions, we could do it in a more nature-based way. We could add, again, instead of adding sewer systems, we could add small basins, open basins. We could add grass. We could take out impermeable surfaces and so on. And I think that is maybe one of the most important times in modern landscape architecture, because we went from being this very, very important and green add-on to a city to actually, and not saying that we didn't solve very, very important issues, but we now are very, very much a key player in solving the issues we have with climate change. I mean, I often say that everything related to climate change has to involve a landscape architect, because all the solutions is within the landscape. We are finding the solutions for heavy rainwater, for example. We're not finding it in the buildings. We're not finding it in the roads. We're finding it in the landscapes around these things. When we talk about energy crisis, well, the new energy we need to produce, solar panels, windmills and some stuff like that, it's again also something that we are placing within the landscape. We have issues with sea level rises, and the solutions to protect our cities is at the coastline. And again, it's modification of the landscape to protect this. So I think we really have, and that's of course it's of course a shame. It's on this background of climate change and the effects of these man-made negative issues. But because of that, we really have a very, very important role solving this. And that's also why I think it's we as an association, for example, with a little amount of number, still can speak at a quite high level, because we are really solving some societal critical issues. And when we then can do that by also adding a recreational value, creating a healthy city, biodiversity, of course, is also a crisis, but also, deal with climate change and then add biodiversity, well, we have a quite good case, I would say.
I think that the Copenhagen flood and the downpour that happened in 2011 is my favorite example. And of course, it was a tragic event, but it shows me this great lesson that Copenhageners got, and the resiliency that you as citizens start to develop. So that's something I really want to share with people outside of Copenhagen when they ask about some aspects of the city. I'm like, yeah, that's one of the defining events of I think the agenda really shifting towards more. Yeah, I don't want to use word green, but something like as you described, right? Like being more knowledgeable about how to act in the city to prevent such events from happening again. We've discussed a lot about the industry overall, but you are also part of CF Møller Architects as a team lead for landscape and urbanism as well. So I just wanted to ask you, what is your approach here in the office? What is your unique approach? You are here for about half a year already, so I know it's not a long time, but what are your achievements?
Well, first of all, I really have tried a lot to be very good friends with my new colleagues. So I think I've done pretty okay in that. Well, they can judge afterwards. The reason why I joined here, I mean, one of the things that I can add to an organization like this is the core knowledge about biodiversity. When I worked as a self-employed before this, had my own little studio and so on, I did a lot of projects both within innovation, circular economy, biodiversity, and such. And all this I did in a kind of small level, and a lot of it was meanwhile projects and so on. And now I really would like to push this knowledge into to more permanent projects and bigger projects, and that's something that I enjoy and try to do every day. And it's difficult, but I also see both from colleagues and clients a huge interest in, especially biodiversity, but we also see a new demand from our clients in terms of reuse materials, in terms of new ways to think landscape architecture. And then I think one of the things that I find most interesting starting working here is actually how our clients is asking for a closer relationship between landscape architecture and the buildings. So not saying that, I think it's very important to say that, of course, we need these independent landscape architecture studios. They do great work, but I also see that there is a very good or huge potential of actually having these integrated studios where we are sitting together and talking, where we're not discussing economy, because we should, of course, but we're basically colleagues. So when sitting with the building architect and the landscape architect at the same time, I feel like my experience is that I actually have a better say, that I'm inviting in before the first sketches of the building is drawn, and we can then develop better architecture projects by having the professions sitting together from the very beginning, and also having discussions on this level where we also need to be able to sit in the canteen afterwards and eat our lunch and drink coffee and all that. And I think that actually, and it sounds a little banal, but I think when we are to do these very complex projects where there needs to be a very close relation between landscape and building, when we don't have that much space, when we need to draw some of the landscape and the functions of the landscape up on top of the building, I think it's quite important that we are closer than we were before. And not saying that you can't do that as an independent building architect working with an independent landscape architect, just saying that this is one of the things that I really find that we really can do well here in CF Møller.
I think that's an ideal scenario when you have an architect and an urbanist or urban designer and landscape architect sitting together and starting the project together, because even buildings are in need of those perspectives of landscape architects and urbanists and so on. But yeah, to inspire the listeners, could you also at the end recommend a book? Something connected to the topic would be ideal.
Yeah. I looked for your questions before I started up here, and I think the hardest one was actually the last one. Not that I'm not reading a lot of books, I really do. And I often would like to recommend something not technical, more like romance and stuff like that. But I think actually the first thing that came to my mind was a very odd book that I stumbled upon a couple of years back, which is called How to Make a Toaster. and it's more or less an art project, I would say. The narrative of this book is basically this guy who wants to create his own toaster. So he starts understanding, and he wants to do it from scratch, and he wants to source the materials himself and stick them together and all that. He learns himself how to create iron. He learns to create plastic, and then he creates this very, very oddly looking toaster that's both very expensive and not super functional, and probably also very, very dangerous because he puts electricity to it. But I think my take on this book is that we are at a time in history where things has become so technical and so complex to do that there is a lot of things you can't do yourself. And there you are super, super dependent on the producers of raw materials for your project, your colleagues, the professions around you, and all that. And to achieve good landscape architecture, you actually need to understand this value chain of different businesses, of different people, of different knowledge and all that. And as a landscape architect, your core role is actually to synthesize all this and not just trying to make your landscape project yourself. You can do that, but then it would look like the toaster does it in this book.
Okay, so there is a connection and link to landscape architecture from the toaster.
I would say so. Yeah.
I'm glad. Thanks a lot. That was quite a surprising recommendation, but I see the connection. So thanks for that. Martin, thanks for joining the series.
Thank you.
Thanks for adding this perspective and your voice to the discussion about landscape architecture that I'm having with my podcast. I think that's definitely not the last episode, because the more I talk about landscape architecture, the more interesting it gets.
Yeah.
and I hope that the listeners feel the same. So thanks a lot. And that's it for today's episode together with Martin. Thanks a lot for listening. You will also be able to have a short article, to read a short article summarizing this discussion on LinkedIn profile of Urbcast. And as I said, that's not the last episode of the landscape architecture series. So also, if you have some aspects or maybe some guests you would like to listen to, just let me know. Thanks a lot and talk to you soon.